Forgiveness. Forgiveness is an interesting subject, and that's what I want to discuss for this video. I think when we say the word forgiveness, automatically there's a religious connotation with that. Um, I'm not sure, I would need to study the positions of Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on in regards to forgiveness. As I understand it, all the major religions have some emphasis on it. But like I said, need to study the other major religions. But with Christianity, certainly, it's something that is, if you grow up in a Christian tradition, and I do, I'm from a Christian family. I'm not practicing myself, but I am from a Christian background. You go to Sunday school, you go to church, and it's something you learn from a very early age that forgiveness is part of being a good Christian. Um, So there's definitely a religious connotation there. That isn't to say that it's unique to faith. I think that it can be practiced and considered in secular circles as well. My own position on forgiveness is a bit ambiguous because I think it very much depends on context. I think a major caveat to forgiveness is that the person who's being forgiven, first of all, needs to acknowledge what they have done. I think forgiveness one of the main arguments in favor of the idea of forgiveness is that it helps to create peace for the forgiver, i.e., the person who's suffered whatever it may be. And this can be a small thing or it can be a big thing. So it could be relatively small, for instance. Um, I mean, small in the grand scheme of things. Let's say you have your bike stolen. Now, let's say the thief is involved in the community sentencing program, and he or she says sorry, and they done it because it was peer pressure or something like that. And then in that sort of situation, you might forgive them because you might see that they're genuinely remorseful. Remember a few years ago reading about a thief who had actually left a sorry note in the house where he had burgled from. He claimed that he had wanted to take money because he wanted to buy his mother a birthday present or something like that. It was a bit of a phony excuse, I thought, but anyway, the householder did in fact forgive the person. Um, so that's relatively small scale, but then you get much more profound things, like say someone who's been the victim of a terrorist attack, or someone who's been the victim, or they're related to the victim of homicide or serious crime. Let's say GBH, rape, things like this. That is a lot more profound. Um, And then there's forgiveness that comes into a social issue of wider forgiveness as part of reconciliation. The part of the world I come from, that's very much an issue. Northern Ireland, it's integral to discussion around the peace process. Now, I should say, I never personally suffered grievance in the Troubles. I never lost anyone close to myself. So I was very fortunate in that regard. But I do know for those who did, it's a major issue. At the time of the Good Friday Agreement, and for my international viewers, that was basically the name of the agreement when Tony Blair was Prime Minister to bring peace in Northern Ireland. Um, it could be argued to have been successful in the sense it ended the main bulk of the conflict, but it was still highly controversial because, as part of the negotiations, it meant that convicted terrorists were freed after, in some cases, only serving not even a couple of years. I mean, imagine a scenario where a serial killer is released after 2 years. That's what people in Northern Ireland had to see happening. I remember seeing a headline in one newspaper saying, "Killers go free, but the guns remain." I forget which newspaper, but that was something that a lot of people found hard to stomach. And to this day, it causes a lot of bitterness that that had that happened. Um, of course, the more complex issue would be if it didn't happen, then the conflict as it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s would be continuing. So there are those who would say it was a utilitarian choice. Um, and these sort of questions have been renewed with the death of Martin McGuinness in the last few days. There's been, I think, a lot more response to his death than there was to Ian Paisley's, which is interesting. I was actually comparing the newspaper reports. I collect newspapers. There was far more coverage in the press of McGuinness's death than there was of Paisley's, at least from the newspapers I have. But the point I'm making is that with his death, there's been these renewed questions about forgiveness. Here's the thing I would say. I mean, in the case of Martin McGuinness, he did dedicate his later life to the peace process, and I don't think that should be downplayed. I think it is important. But many victims of IRA terrorism would say he only done it for his own, to prevent being prosecuted himself. Norman Tebbit said he was a coward for that reason. So that's a very blunt way to look at it. But, who would I be, or who would anyone be, to judge Norman Tebbit, who personally suffered from the terrorism that Martin McGuinness was so closely associated with as a senior IRA commander. Um, and I think that's the difficulty. I mean, I do feel a little bit miffed off when some people of religious persuasion um, sort of preach about forgiveness to other people. I think forgiveness is a very personal thing. It's something that you cannot tell others to do. So, devout Christians have no right to tell a victim of crime or a victim of terrorism, you should forgive that person, or you have to forgive that person. It's something that has to be a personal decision to do because it is so profound. I mean, I think that's incredibly condescending to tell someone who's suffered enormously on a personal level, you should forgive that person. Even if you believe it is a good thing for them because it would help them to get closure, that's a very personal thing. Now, if some thug just randomly assaulted me in the street because they're drunk or because, you know, they didn't like the look of me, and then a week later, I'm, ranting about it because I'm angry and I'm upset. Then someone turns around and says, "Oh, you should forgive the thug. It'll help you move on." I would be pissed off. And that's just an example. I mean, I really think forgiveness is a personal thing. I do see its merit. I do see the argument that it helps victims to find closure, but I really, really think the caveat has to be that the person you're forgiving has shown genuine remorse, and that isn't just about saying sorry. It's about recognizing what they've done wrong. Now, I've been hurt by people in my life, people close to me, and I've forgiven them. And the reason I've forgiven them is twofold. Firstly, they did show genuine remorse. And secondly, because I cared about the person, because I didn't want to end up being consumed by bitterness towards him. And these were things that did hurt me quite a lot, not physically, but emotionally. Um, and I'm not going into further details simply because, I want to respect their privacy. I don't want to talk about other people without their consent in that context. But suffice to say, I've been hurt by people. And I forgave them because I loved them. And, without wanting to be too sentimental about it, that's how I felt. So, sure, I felt angry with them at the time. Pretty angry, in fact. It wasn't just like I was annoyed in a minor way, I was pretty pissed off and bitter at the time, frankly. But as time passed, as I understood the person was genuinely remorseful, and I did end up forgiving them on more than one occasion. And I'm sure there's been times I've hurt people because I'm human, and it's no one can say that they're perfect. So I'm sure there's been times I've done things, I've said things that I shouldn't have said. I've done things that I shouldn't have done, and I know there's been times in my life I've approached others and said I was wrong about that. I'm sorry. Now, whether they forgive me or not, certainly I know in cases I have fallen out with people, I approach them to say sorry, and they seem to have moved on, so I would assume that's forgiveness. Either forgiveness or they didn't see it as that big a deal. Because we also tend to associate forgiveness as being quite a loaded thing. So, I mean, we wouldn't talk about forgiveness in the sense that, I don't know, you're half an hour late to an appointment with a mate, a friend. I don't think forgiveness would come into something like that because it's not profound enough for that. Because your friend's going to be a bit annoyed. You might have an argument, but I think the forgiveness would actually come about from words said in the argument, not from the original thing. But I don't think there can be forgiveness if the person who you're forgiving or being expected to forgive has shown no remorse. Now, I've also had the experience where people have hurt me and they haven't given a damn about it, and I haven't forgiven them. It's not that I've clung on to bitterness at this point, I don't care about. But I didn't forgive them because I think to have forgiveness, you have to have a basis to forgive. I think forgiveness in its own is shallow. I do think it serves a purpose. I think, like I said, I found that when people have hurt me and they've shown remorse and then I've forgiven them, it is closure. It's a nice feeling. But the caveat to that was that they were remorseful. Now, if they'd never said sorry, if they'd never acknowledged how they hurt me, I don't know if I would have forgiven them. And maybe I would have found a way to move on with it because I had to. But I really, really think that has to be the caveat to forgiveness. I don't think people should go around with a warlike mindset like that person wronged me and I'm going to be bitter for the rest of my life. But there are certain things that are so profound in how they hurt people. Telling someone to forgive that, I think, is. I mean, asking a woman to forgive her rapist, asking someone whose home has been burned down by arsonists, asking someone who's been permanently disabled by terrorism. It's not to say those people can't forgive the perpetrators, but I really think it is a personal thing that they have to decide themselves if it's something they want to do. And I don't think people of faith should patronize them and say you have to do that. I respect people of faith in having the strength to do it, but I don't think it's something you can expect others to do. And sometimes even people of faith, they've been hurt so deeply that even they can't bring themselves to associate themselves with that theocratic idea of forgiveness. I remember seeing there's a scene in the film Born on the 4th of July. In that film, if you're familiar with the film, the character Ron Kovic, based on a true story, he had perhaps accidentally shot his friend in the heat of battle. He visits his friend's family in rural, somewhere in the Midwest, and I don't know if it's the sister or the fiance of the friend he killed. She said, "I can never forgive you, but maybe God can." Now that was a religious family, and that to me indicated that even among people of faith, sometimes forgiveness is extremely difficult because people are not robots. I think you have to have anger. Anger is a natural response to injustice. I think there's no way you can forgive someone without going through the process of anger in the first place. So that's why I think it can be a mistake to forgive too quickly. It's a mistake because it won't necessarily lead to closure, because then you may reflect and think, was that person really sorry? Did I forgive too quickly, etc.? So I think there has to be some time as well. That's another factor. But summed up, I think it is a very personal thing. I think there's some things that can't be forgiven. I mean, you could never expect parents of a murdered child, for example, to forgive, let's say, a child sex offender. You could never forgive. There's just certain things that are so heinous. I mean, I read today a report about a young man whose girlfriend had actually put acid in his face, blinded for life. She's been given a whole life tariff, and I hope the court upholds that. This evil woman had some bizarre obsession with the model Katie Price, apparently, or um, not Katie Price. It was another model who had been the victim of an acid attack, and apparently she got this sick obsession with trying to do the same thing. God knows what her motivation was, but to do that to a young man, to blind him for life, I felt sickened reading it. Um, Now, no one could expect that young man to forgive her. If he chooses to forgive her, that's his prerogative. But if he hated her for the rest of his life, who the hell could blame him? So there are certain crimes, certain acts that are so heinous. I think, and it is interesting seeing the different responses that people have. I mean, the way Norman Tebbit responded to Martin McGuinness's death was very different from the way other victims of the Brighton bombing did. The daughter of another MP who was killed in the Brighton bombing said Norman Tebbit doesn't represent all of us. Um, but people deal with things in different ways. Now, to put that in context, Norman Tebbit's response was very blunt. He basically said Martin Guinness was a Roman Catholic. I hope there's a particularly hot corner in hell for him. So he didn't mince his words, that's how he felt. Some people would judge Norman Tebbit and say he's being too bitter, he's being too harsh. He'd been injured himself. His wife was permanently disabled, and he'd seen friends killed. So, on one hand, you can dismiss Norman Tebbit as a bitter old man, but that's how he, that's his honest response to it. And I don't think people can judge others from that. Anger is a very powerful human emotion. It's a very honest human emotion. Anyway, I'll round this up. Forgiveness, it's a very interesting subject. What do you think? Feel free to let me know if you've had your own example. Have you been forgiven? Because that's, of course, another angle. Maybe you yourself have done something you were deeply ashamed of and you hoped the person would forgive you. I mean, no one's perfect. I've done things in my life I'm not proud of. And maybe I've let people down and people have forgiven me. So none of us should play God and assume that we ourselves are not capable of hurting other people. Sometimes maybe we don't intend to, but we do. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on forgiveness. Have you forgiven? Have you expected others to forgive you? What was the context? Um, Summed up, I think it's a very personal thing, and I think for me personally, I would forgive people, but only if I felt they really were remorseful, and only if it was something that I felt I could move on from. There would be certain things I don't think I could forgive. I don't know, but my assumption would be that I couldn't. If someone, for example, murdered the woman I loved, I think I can't envisage forgiving that person. But that's something I've thankfully not experienced. Let me know your thoughts. Cheers.